Greetings and welcome. Today we're reading a piece of history and a piece of interpretation of the Holocaust, which is really just enormously powerful. It's the book by Wendy Lauer called The Ravine. This is a very different kind of Holocaust history because it focuses on a particular experience in a particular place at a particular time, the Ukrainian city of Mariupol. It isn't a survivor memoir because it's based on an historian writing 60 or 70 years after the events, but it is experiential. It's trying to reproduce and reconstruct and discover, almost in the way that a detective tries to work out the circumstances of a crime. The skilled historian here is trying to use all kinds of evidence to reconstruct the context, the background, and the people who were involved in this massacre in Mariupol, as depicted in this single, violent, horrifying photograph. So we might talk for just a little bit, and I hope we'll have some discussion of this in class as well, about the use of photography both as memorial. Photography is very powerful in terms of representing and remembering and respecting events of the past, but also as a forensic or an evidentiary source. It's worth us thinking about the role that photographs play, in particular in this book, The Ravine, but also in historical research more broadly. Wendy Lauer is very clear that photography is purposive and intentional. It is not simply a flat representation of what occurred. It's not just an unstructured, unperspectival representation of reality. Rather, it is selective and purposive. She makes it very clear that Skrovina, the Slovak photographer, had a narrative. He had a purpose. He had intentions, though those intentions were different from what she had initially imagined when she began investigating the photograph. But at the same time, she points out that this photograph and other photographs which she uncovers in the course of her research, these photographs provide unbelievably important insight into the human realities of this moment, this horrific moment of killing and cruelty. For example, the discovery of the second child in the mother's arms. An unremarkable detail of the photo may shed light on the circumstances of the event that even the photographer herself or himself was unaware of. And we see that throughout the book. She looks at many photographs and discovers by the number of buttons on a uniform that this is a German officer, but not a German officer of the Wehrmacht, but rather of a border patrol. So let's do a little bit of historical scene setting. Barbarossa is the code name that was given to Hitler's surprise attack on the Soviet Union. I say surprise because there was a pact, a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. At the same time, it shouldn't have been a surprise to the Soviets. There was lots of intelligence that the Wehrmacht, the German army, was gathering forces on the borders of Ukraine, and the Soviet Union had moved forward from Poland. And therefore, Stalin and the Red Army and its forces should have been well prepared. Nonetheless, on June 22nd, 1941, there was a massive armored air and infantry attack involving millions of troops, thousands of tanks, hundreds to thousands of aircraft, along a several thousand kilometer front of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and it was remarkably successful. Lots and lots of territory was covered in the first week, the first month of the initiative. And Stalin and the Red Army were disastrously unprepared. Stalin regarded himself as a master tactician and strategist. He did not believe that Hitler would attack at this time. And his forces were just disastrously unprepared. Hitler's goals were quite clear, and they were clear even from Mein Kampf, the horrific but revealing book that he had written in the 1920s, 30s. His goal was to capture the vast agricultural land, Lebensraum, he called it, of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine, and Central and Eastern Europe, killing and expelling the Slavs who currently lived there, and capturing also the petroleum resources, the factories, and the productive capacity of the Soviet Union. His idea was to establish a large German empire, a large German landmass, which would allow them to compete permanently with other major powers in the world. His objectives towards the USSR and the Slav peoples, including Poles and Ukrainians and Lithuanians and the Baltic countries, his goals towards these Slavic peoples, these goals were as genocidal and horrific as his ambition to exterminate Europe's Jews. Hitler expected to inflict massive starvation in the Ukraine and the USSR. Literally, tens of millions of people was his idea, to simply pull away all of the food sources and allow these people to starve. And the willingness of Germans to allow people to starve is quite evident in their treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Through the course of the war, 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war were starved to death. Let's take a minute to talk about Babi Yar, and we're going to talk about Babi Yar a little bit later as well. But Babi Yar is the worst and largest killing early in Barbarossa, early in the invasion of the Soviet Union and Ukraine, September 29th, 1941, just outside of Kiev in the Ukraine. It was a mass killing by Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, and in the course of about a week, 34,000 victims, Jewish men, women, and children, were gathered from Kiev and the surrounding area. They were gathered, they were brutalized, they were terrorized, they were often raped and tortured, and then they were shot and buried in shooting pits where they died. Babi Yar was, the name Babi Yar refers to a ravine 2 miles from the center of the city, and we've learned from the book that we've just read that ravines were chosen because they were easy places to bury the dead. But Babi Yar was only 2 miles from the center of the city, and therefore convenient to move large numbers of Jewish people to that destination and then kill them. They were shot by machine guns and rifles and buried where they died. 2 years later, the Nazis tried to conceal the facts of Babi Yar in 1943, exhuming and burning corpses to conceal the magnitude of this horrific crime against humanity. And the Soviets, in an odd way, but in the end maybe not an odd way, they played their own role in concealing the importance of Babi Yar by seeking to minimize the Jewishness of the victims. They sought to represent Babi Yar as a crime against civilians, but not against Jews. And in fact, there was no memorial to the deaths at Babi Yar until decades later. Now back to the book, back to Lower's book, The Ravine. It's worth all of us thinking about the kinds of evidence, the kinds of sources which Wendy Lower uses in this book. The book is both personal and professional. I hope you had the experience, which I did, of being just completely drawn into the narrative. Her specific questions about the individuals, who are these participants? Who is this woman holding her child as she's being shot to death? Who are the shooters whose faces you can see? What is their nationality? What military units do they belong to? We're drawn into these questions, almost not believing that you could ever come to a good and evidence-based answer to these questions. It's the amazing accomplishment of this book that almost all of those questions are answered. She is a resourceful historian who uses a very wide variety of sources of evidence, including research on foot. She visits the location and explores the forest and the hills and the terrain around Metropole to find the terrain of the massacre and the shooting pit. She also uses interviews that she conducted herself in Metropole with a few people, but also interviews with people who may have witnessed these events in 1941 especially. And she is able to locate in various archives investigations that occurred by Germany, by Czech secret police, and by Soviet investigators of this particular massacre. So she also has access to, or has had access to, archives which only became available after the fall of the Soviet Union. These Soviet archives, and this is an important fact to realize about the history of the Holocaust, that the Soviets conquered most of the territory where the killings, the majority of the killings occurred. And the Soviets, for their own reasons, were not very forthcoming about the nature and purposes and brutality of these killings. So it was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that Soviet archives were made available to investigators from the West, who could then learn, as Timothy Snyder writes in the book that you'll be reading next week, as bad as we thought the Holocaust was, it was even worse. She also makes use of German Nazi archives, the orders that were issued, the records of military and civil actions throughout the war, and in particular in the occupied territories of Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, and so forth. We have now read about the order police. You've seen order police referred to several times in Wendy Lauer's book. Order police were units of ordinary German policemen who were deployed behind the Wehrmacht, behind the German army, to secure order in the conquered territories. But they were also almost immediately deployed to begin the execution of Jews in the conquered territories. They became along with the professional murder squads dispatched by the Nazi army, the order police were more ordinary policemen who nonetheless played a crucial role in the carrying out of the final solution in Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and elsewhere. And we will return to the question of the order police and what their makeup was, what their motives were when we read Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men. Another really important party in the photograph, it's visible in the photograph, but it's also a part of the historical record of the killings in Metropole and in Kiev, in Babi Yar, and in just about every other part of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Ukrainian police units and militias were willing collaborators with the Einsatzgruppen, the killing squads of the German army and SS, and the special order units in the conquered territories. Ukrainian police were not coerced, they were not slave laborers involved in the business of murder. Rather, they willingly participated with and collaborated with the killing plans of Nazi occupiers. The Ukrainian police and militias played essential and willing roles in the capture, detention, and murder of the Jews of the cities and villages throughout conquered territories of Ukraine. And there was a pre-existing Ukrainian fascist political organization, the Hlinka Guard, and also the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN, that was fully supportive of Nazi goals. In fact, welcomed the Nazis as their partner and kind of military ally in their opposition to the Soviet Union. It is somewhat appalling to realize that within the first year of German conquest of first Poland and then Ukraine, 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews perished in the first year or so of the German conquest, of the Barbarossa campaign. There are important insights in this book. It's a dramatic book about a particular incident, but I think it also has important implications for us as we're thinking about evil in history and the evil that human beings do to each other, that human organizations, that nations, that armies do to ordinary human beings. First, the importance of this is a point that Wendy Lauer makes, and I think it's a really very important point, the importance of recognizing the particular individuals and families who were extinguished. It is simply horrifying to realize that whole family lines disappeared. There's no progeny of those lines. Second, there is we get a really clear understanding of the deliberate cruelty of the Aktion, the military and paramilitary actions leading to the massacre of the Jews of Metropole and other places in Ukraine and Lithuania and the Baltic countries and the Soviet Union. The deliberate extinction of the Jews of Metropole, not in the old-fashioned way which also was horrible, the pogroms of Russia in the early part of the 20th century, but a very systematic, sadistic torture and degradation of the victims, rape and abuse committed by the Germans and Ukrainians, followed by their brutal, systematic killing by gunfire. We also see some evidence of occasional kindness and compassion of ordinary Ukrainian neighbors. It isn't the case that every Ukrainian, every person, every non-Jew in Metropole was supportive of the killing and the atrocious treatment of the Jews, though many were. But we do see occasional instances of a willingness to hide Jews, to support them in their efforts to escape. And then finally, we get a really interesting perspective on the motives and the mentality, the inner life of the photographer, the Slovak photographer, Lubomir Skrovina. And we see through the research that Wendy Lauer has done, his humanity and his effort to resist the horrors which he is witnessing. She makes a very strong case that his use of his camera and then his distribution of these photographs to resistance groups in Slovakia and Czechoslovakia, or in the Czech region, that his effort was to show the atrocities which the Germans were committing in Ukraine. So the term Bloodlands is a term which Timothy Snyder used in his book called Bloodlands. That's not the book that we're reading. We're reading Black Earth starting next week. But he uses the term to refer to the very large swath of Eastern and Central Europe between Moscow and Berlin. And his basic point, Snyder's basic point, is that these bloodlands were the location of the largest numbers of deaths and murder and genocide which occurred between 1935 and 1945. When we read The Ravine, we come to see Metropole as one small town with two mass killings, about 2 months apart, mass killings of the Jews of Metropole. So we see on a microcosm the application of the final solution in Ukraine. And it is simply a microcosm of the bloodlands which extended from the Baltic to the far extreme of Eastern Europe. The rapid efforts by the Nazi military, the SS, and then the collaborating national militias and police forces of nations like Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine to exterminate the Jews of those countries, Ukraine, USSR, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. There are over 1,000 sites of massacres like those described in Metropole across the bloodlands, ranging from a few hundred victims to the over 30,000 men, women, and children who were murdered in Kiev. So we can ask, what is general about this story? Is it just an account of this particular atrocity, or is there something more general? And I think there are several general points we can pull out. One is that the mass killings which occurred in Metropole occurred in 1,000 places across Eastern and Central Europe. Babi Yar, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that the mass killings were directed at Jews and they were directed at all Jews, men, women, and children, whole families of people killed and brutalized as a deliberate effort of policy and of the use of violent force. We can see through her analysis of the killings which occurred in Metropole that it was organized and systematic. It was not a pogrom, a kind of crazed moment of violence. Rather, it was organized, systematic use of force and violence to kill all the Jews of this town. The fourth generality that we can see is that it represents the collaboration which occurred between the Nazi military, the SS, and the Allied forces of Allied nations, including Ukraine, Slovakia, Lithuania, Poland. This collaboration is difficult to acknowledge today. There is a desire in Poland and Ukraine to say these were Nazis who did these terrible deeds, but history does not support that. Nazis were the primary impetus, but the actions were carried out by Ukrainians, Slovaks, Poles, and others. Another general point that I think we can draw from this is the commonness, the ubiquity of neighbors betraying Jews to the murderous militias, police, and military forces who came to them. The sometimes romanticized view that a Polish village or Ukrainian village, or for that matter possibly a French city, would protect its Jews or its people, its friends, its neighbors to the last, simply isn't true in Metropole. People were very willing to betray their neighbors. The pervasiveness of anti-Jewish hatred, contempt, and disrespect, the fact both by the Nazis but also by Ukrainian anti-Semites of treating Jews, Roma, and in the case of the Nazis anyway, Slavs as being subhuman. This is an important clue about the nature of genocide more generally, the dehumanization of the victims. It is a capsule summary of the final solution. So as we look forward, what you've, I certainly hope that all of us have found reading The Ravine to be an amazingly powerful and insightful experience. I believe the book gives a concrete and experiential perspective on the atrocities that were to come. The experience of Metropole was completely atrocious, cruel, murderous, evil, and yet it was a very small element of a much, much larger picture which will occur throughout the Bloodlands, throughout Ukraine, Poland, Soviet Union, the Baltic countries. And next week, we'll begin reading Tim Snyder's remarkable history, but also more traditional historical narrative of this period and place. And we'll learn more about the Bloodlands of Eastern Europe, and we will learn more about the remarkable extent and depth of evil during this period of time.